G'day everyone, and welcome to our first episodes of Aussie Yarns by the Fire. We're reading Great Australian Yarns by Paul Taylor. So I'll start with the preface. Tonight we'll go into our first story. A ripping yarn is a true story, or a purportedly true story, heard or read with the mouth agape. The lips move now and then, involuntarily. Awe, fear, astonishment, revulsion, excitement, sometimes even humour. The words that come out depend on upbringing and the category of the ripping yarn. Yarns that curdle the blood and send a shudder up the spine, such as the diabolical saga of the Batavia. You haven't heard of the Batavia? It's going to be a good one. The convicts who ate one another, the penal death camps, or sadistic serial killers will draw instant, powerful responses, often expletives deleted in polite conversation. Other yarns may be quirky and amusing. Lola Montez, the firecracker who flogged the Ballarat newspaper editor, or Percy Granger, the eccentric composer who flogged himself and his lady friends, trigger an irresistible titter. Heroic yarns of superhuman endeavour bring reverent responses. Tales of sporting, daring do, stimulant our vernaculars, you little beauty reaction. The ripping yarns in this book are true, but for the most part, sadly, they are not the stories history teachers tell. John Norton, it's safe to say, is someone few know, yet the rambunctious life of this outstanding scoundrel sums up the best and the worst of Sydney at the turn of the 19th century. The tales or myths of the romantic and perhaps not coincidentally handsome outlaws Matthew Brady, Ben Hall, and Ned Kelly passed over in a few paragraphs in the history books, nonetheless vividly reveal the social structure, the morals, and the mores of their time, and help explain the legacy they have left us. Other characters, such as the imitable confidence trickster Arthur Orton, leave us marvelling at the gullibility of the Victorian era, but then invite us to reflect on the adulation we give to the Alan Bonds of our own day. John Giles Price, the inhuman commandant gratifyingly beaten to death by convicts from the hell hulks at Williamstown, reminds us of the cruelty that was so common and is so frighteningly recent in our society. And then there are the minor players and the stories from our tribal memory, the pajama girl in her viewing bath and the shark arm mystery at the Coogee Aquarium, the gangsters and their gun moles, Fisher's ghost which fingered a killer, and Federici, the phantom of the Princess Theatre who some say still haunts the stage. These are people, events, incidents, and shadows largely forgotten but integral to our extraordinary heritage. The expression ripping yarn was most likely born in the common rooms of the musty dorms of the English public school in the late 19th century, inspired and nurtured by the adventurous and bloody expansion of the British Empire. The ripping yarns in this book, however, were made in Australia and can be summed up colloquially in that quintessential Australian exclamation, Ripper. Paul Taylor. Yarn 1. First Blood. Nightmare on the Coral Islands. A century and a half before the arrival of the First Fleet heralded a white settlement of Australia in 1788. Two young Dutchmen landed on the mainland of West Australia. Vile, treacherous, serial murderers they were, our first white settlers. The two didn't choose to come to Australia. It was settle or swing. They settled. And the last the pair saw of the civilization they left behind was a row of bodies, hands severed, dangling and fly blown on a barren, awful island of death. Jan Pelgrim, Die By, and Wouter Loos, two of the 316 men, women, and children who sailed on the Dutch merchant vessel Batavia, were put ashore, marooned in 1629 as punishment for their part in a mutiny, the bloodiest in history. All told, 210 from the Batavia died on the 3 tiny coral islands just off the coast of mainland Australia. But life in the 17th century was cheap, and sea voyages were notoriously risky. Mutinies, pirates, shipwrecked, fever, and madness were common. What distinguishes the Batavia story from other stories of shipwrecks is the unremitting pageant of the worst of human nature it revealed on a vast, grotesque canvas. Surreal savagery, lust, treachery, cowardice, daily for week upon week, gruesome murder. It was a nightmare that began almost as soon as the Batavia set sail from Holland in October 1628. The Batavia, the flagship of the Dutch East India Company, the finest Dutch East Indiaman afloat, was on her maiden voyage, leading a fleet to her namesake city in Java in the East Indies, Jakarta. Jakarta in modern-day Indonesia. On board were sailors, soldiers, and merchants, and their women and children under the fleet commander, the company's senior merchant, Francisco Pelcet. The Batavia was captained by Ariane Jacobs. In the hold were chests containing a fortune, 250,000 guilders in silver coin, a casket brimming with gold and jewels, and 600 tons of wine, cheeses, and cloth. The Batavia looked a splendid vessel, as those who went aboard a meticulous reconstruction of the ship discovered when she sailed to Sydney in 2000. Built of Baltic oak, canvas sails fully rigged, her hull green and gold, and with a red lion proud on her figurehead, she was, on deck and safe in sedate Darling Harbour, every inch a ship that would bring out the old sea dog in the most landlocked of lovers. Below decks, it was a different story. In many places, you had to stoop to move among the huge winches, the cannons, and the precipitous companion ladders that shared a stiflingly stuffy, cramped, and claustrophobic area. There, in 1628, where more than 300 slept, bloated rats and cockroaches scuttled from stem to stern, feces and urine disgorged from the bilges, and it was a foul going in the fairest of weathers for all but the ship's commanders. The captain, Jacobs, and his superior, Pellicert. These two were to sail the Batavia into waters never dreamed of, far more unpleasant than the cramped squalor below decks. Pellicert and Jacobs were at odds with each other from the beginning. They had been together on a previous voyage to the Dutch East Indies colony, and they disliked each other intensely. Jacobs particularly resented the fact that it was company policy to put a merchant in command above him. Their hatred was exacerbated by a passenger, Lucretia van den Milen, a beautiful and voluptuous young woman sailing to join her husband in the Dutch colony. Jacobs lusted after Lucretia, but Pelcert took care of her. Too much care, perhaps. Francisco Pelcert was a dasher. At the gorgeous court of the great Mogul in Agra, he had dallied with slave girls and seduced the wives of courtiers. On the Batavia, he was in command, and Captain Jacobs had to make do with Lucretia's maidservant, Zwanti Hendricks. Unlike her mistress, with whom she soon quarrelled and left, Zwanti was all too willing. On 14 April, after 6 months at sea, the Batavia, the other 9 ships in the merchant fleet, and the man-o'-war accompanying it reached the Cape of Good Hope and dropped anchor. While Pelcert was occupied taking on provisions, Jacobs and Zwanti went on a ship crawl, a belligerent drinking binge that took them from ship to ship docked in the port. With them was a former apothecary from Haarlem, Geronimus Cornelis. A suave and cultured man, Cornelis, the ship under merchant, and as such, the third most senior company man on the Batavia after the commander and the captain, had become close friends with Jacobs and his lover, Zwanti. Cornelis was a member of a cult that practiced sexual orgies and sanctioned any crime because its members said, man was made in God's image, and since God inspired each and every idea and action, even murder, he therefore must approve. In addition, Cornelis proved to be a man with the rare and frightening persuasive power of a Charles Manson. Cornelis could control those with weaker personalities. When Commander Pelcert came back on board and learned of the trio's rampage at the Cape, he gave Captain Jacobs a public tongue-lashing. Hatred of Pelcert now began to simmer. The mutinous cauldron began to boil, when 3 weeks later Lucretia van den Meilen was stripped and sexually assaulted by a group, and Pelcert announced he would be taking one of them, the boson, in chains to Batavia. It was Cornelis who hatched the plot that would give the mutineers the Batavia, the treasure in her hold, and the woman he wanted. Like Jacobs, he lusted for Lucretia van den Meilen. Cornelis suggested to the captain that with the help from fellow conspirators, a lance corporal and some of his soldiers, junior officers, and most of Jacobs' crew, they could kill Pelcert and the rest of the soldiers, commandeer the Batavia, take its treasure, and, using the heavily armed vessel as a pirate ship, prey on Dutch East India Company ships plying their rich trade. On the eve of 4th June, the conspirators went to their bunks with weapons hidden and at the ready. Some weeks after leaving the Cape, a storm had separated the Batavia from the fleet, and 2 hours before dawn on 4th of June, the ship found itself alone in the Abrolhos group of islands, some 80 kilometres off the west coast of Australia. Abrolhos is a Portuguese word meaning eyes wide open. Francisco Pelcert was a shrewd, resourceful man, but on the night of 4th June, he was sick in his cabin, and Jacobs, although he kept his eyes open, failed to keep them open wide enough. It was a bright, moonlit night, and the sea glistened so much that he or the pilot mistook the reef's foaming fringe for moonlight reflection. The Batavia, with all sails set, smashed onto the coral rocks. Pelcert rushed up on deck and roared for the cannons to be dumped overboard, where, exactly 334 years later, on 4 June 1963, divers found many of them alongside remains of the ship. Jettisoning the cannons made no difference. The ship kept striking, and now a new storm was brewing. Pelcert ordered the anchor to be dropped and the mainmast cut down. Its loss only made matters worse. The Batavia, Pelcert saw, was stuck and fast and breaking up. But through the storm, he could see an island about 3 leagues away, with 2 smaller islands, little more than outcrops of rock beside it. The islands were their only chance, and that morning Pelcert ordered the women and children put ashore while the crew struggled to salvage all possible food and supplies. Foolishly, the crew ignored the fresh water on board, presuming there would be plenty on the islands, and took the opportunity to break into the grog. As the storm raged, 180 people were safely landed on the main island and 40 on the smallest, among them the warring commander and the captain. Also landed were food and a few barrels of water. On the second day, more crew and passengers, merchandise, and some of the silver coins and jewels were taken off. On the third day, it was decided to take off Cornelis and the 70 others who were still on the Batavia. Heavy seas beat the crew back 4 times. With a heavy heart, Pelcert later said, "He left, with the utmost grief, my lieutenant and 70 men on the very point of perishing on board the vessel. Sink or swim. As condition worsened, 30 of them sank. Tragically, Cornelis was not among them. Eventually, 10 days later, he swam and survived, to be greeted as a hero when he at last made it to land." In the meantime, the castaways on the island began to explore their new habitat. There were birds and fish, but no fresh water, and Pelcert knew the group would quickly die unless water was found. For the next 3 days, he oversaw the hurried construction of 2 skiffs with a covering decks built from timbers from the wreck of the Batavia. Intending to find water on the mainland, he set sail on 8 June with 47 others, among them Jacobs, Swanty Hendricks, and Jan Everts, the bosun. The rocky, barren west coast of the Great South mainland was guarded by high cliffs and treacherous breakers, and the little ships sailed and were blown further and further north, looking vainly for a safe landing. With just enough water to keep them going, and 1,000 kilometres from the wreck, Palsert decided the best course was to keep going and make for Java and Batavia. Without Commander Palsert, the castaways began to die. They had soon drunk all the water taken off the Batavia, and about 20 had perished of thirst when at last rain fell and they collected the precious drops in sail sheets. Jerome Cornelis made it to shore and by right of his under merchant title took command of the company. Immediately he began to resurrect his mutinous fantasy. This time he planned to restore and rehabilitate the Batavia, run up the pirate flag and seize the expected rescue ship from Java. Then, with the salvaged treasure and the merchandise in the hold of the new ship, he and his cohorts would be free to roam and rob. Cornelis demanded that his fellow conspirators sign a pirate compact, a solemn oath of allegiance with a list of regulations. He was to be the Captain General. To ensure there were fewer mouths to feed and to satisfy his psychotic urges, he ordered the murder of all those who were not a party to the compact. Men, women, and children. Only the most comely women were to be spared. These women would be shared by the mutineers. The beautiful Lucretia, however, was his alone. She was to be his concubine. The killings began. At first they were covert and under cover of darkness. People would be killed at night and buried in secret, or taken out on rafts in search of water and drowned. Then the killings became open and increasingly orgiastic. Merchants, junior officers, soldiers, even cabin boys, hacked to death, drowned, bashed, beheaded, or strangled. Men, women, children, and infants. As the murders went on, day after day, week after week, the killers became drunk with bloodlust and, in a gorgeous uniform of red coats embroidered with gold and silver from material looted from the ship's hold, began a frightful game, hunting down their prey and contriving even more sadistic ways to kill. It seemed nothing could stop the atrocities until, on one of the small islands, Weeb Hayes, a soldier sent with an unarmed party of around 25 others to find water, in reality, to get them off the main island, noticed two pools of water that rose and fell with the tide. Was it salt water? He took a sip. It was fresh water, and in abundance. Weeb Hayes, unaware of the reign of terror on the main island, sent up the arranged smoke signal to Cornelis. Water found. At the same time, the first of a score of men escaped, swimming to the small island. Hayes learned of the unspeakable atrocities on the other islands and knew that he had to prepare for an attack. He held the water supply. With those who had escaped, he and his men numbered 45 against Cornelis and his mutineers, 36 men and 5 women. But Cornelis' troops were armed with pikes, swords, adze, and muskets. Hayes' men hurriedly dug in, set up a stockade, and began making pikes, and morning stars from timbers and barrel hoops washed ashore. Then they waited for the inevitable attack. On 27 July, Cornelis sent to the island a cadet, Daniel Cornelison, with a letter to the soldiers inviting them to join the mutineers. The soldiers promptly gave Hayes the letter, and he ordered the boy to be taken prisoner and sat back to wait for the attack. When it came, the defenders beat it off, throwing rocks and stones and taking the fight to the invaders. A second attack came within a week, and this time Cornelis was there to command it. 3 boatloads of mutineers tried to land on the shore, but Hayes' men were waded into the water and once again drove them back, taunting the mutineers whose muskets failed to fire. Events now began to echo the chapter in Robert Louis Stevenson's classic pirate story, Treasure Island, and it is possible that Stevenson may have been inspired by the saga of the Batavia. In the novel The Hispaniola, mutineers swear oaths of allegiance to their leader, Long John Silver, attempt to storm the stockade and are repulsed. Silver tries to persuade the cabin boy Jim to desert and lead a second attempt to take the stockade when this is rejected. On Weeb Hayes Coral Island, Jeronimus Cornelius, routed twice, decided to offer a small boat in exchange for wine and blankets. At the same time, he once again secretly tried to bribe some of the soldiers into joining him. Weeb Hayes was a man whose will was as strong as that of Cornelius. He had no intention of bartering with the killers, and at his signal his men fell upon and seized Cornelius and 5 others, killed 4 and let slip Jacob Pietz, who escaped back to the main island to join in his fellow mutineers, lick wounds and plan the next attempt. Hayes, however, now had a boat. 2 weeks later, on September 17, the mutineers tried a third assault. 4 of Hayes' soldiers died from gunshots in the first rally, and the situation was looking grim. Then, as the mutineers retired to reload, the defenders saw beyond them a ship, the Sardam, with Francisco Pelcert aboard, making its way through the reef. At the same time, the mutineers saw the Sardam. Both sides made a dash for boats and rowed furiously to be the first to the rescue ship. Aboard the Sardam, Commander Pelcert was about to step into a skip loaded with bread when Hayes' ship came alongside and the soldier gasped out his incredible story. Pelcert had just enough time to get Hayes and his men aboard and ordered cannons primed and muskets at the ready when 2 boats came alongside, manned by men bristling with weapons. They were dressed in Cornelius' lavish embroidered uniform. The men in the boats protested that they came as friends, but refused to put down their weapons and asked to be taken on board to explain matters. Pelcert instead gave them the choice of surrendering or being blown out of the water. The men put down their weapons. The remaining mutineers on the main island were quickly rounded up, put in irons, and tortured. They confessed, one by one. The first man to break, John Bremen, confessed to murdering 27 men. Pelcert called a council. Rather than risk taking all back to Batavia for trial, the council decided to execute the most dangerous mutineers then and there. Cornelius was the first to go. He had undergone 5 torture sessions before he confessed, but finally, on the morning of 2 October, Australia's first serial killer was taken to the island site of many deaths, Batavia Graveyard. First, they brought Cornelius to a block and hacked off his hands. Then he was dragged to a makeshift gallows. He had said under torture, "Sometimes circumstances force one to do a great many things one would rather not have to do." But that was not the real Jeronimus Cornelius speaking. His last words were much more in character. From his evil heart he roared in vain defiance, "Revenge! Revenge!" Then they strung him up. Cornelius was followed by 7 men who once were simply soldiers or carpenters, merchants or cabin boys, murderers such as Matty Beer, a 21-year-old soldier. Beer confessed to killing, or helping to kill, 9 people. He cut off the head of Cohen Alderts to test the sharpness of a sword. Others were taken to Batavia to be executed, hanged, or broken on the block, bound to a cartwheel with their limbs shattered and left to die a slow, agonizing death. Cadet Daniel Corneliusson, who carried the message to Weeb Hayes and was held prisoner, had his right hand severed and was executed. Solomon Deschamps, a merchant, was forced to strangle a baby poisoned by Cornelius. On the voyage back, he was thrice keel-hauled, dragged by ropes beneath the ship's keel. And outside Batavia Castle on 31 January 1630, while a huge crowd watched, he and others like him were given 100 lashes and executed. The worst of them, men like Jacob Pietz, who had escaped from Weeb Hayes and led the last of the mutineers, were broken from under, upwards, and the body exposed on a wheel. And on the Coral Island, 2 others were spared. Jan Pelgrom Debye, a cabin boy, 18, murdered another boy and helped kill a man and a woman. He had cried when Matty's Beer was given the honour of cutting off the head of Cohen Alderts. He cried again when he was sentenced to hang and begged for mercy. Pelcert gave it and ordered instead that he was to be marooned on the Australian mainland. Waterloos, a soldier took part in killings and took command of mutineers when Cornelius was captured, but he had been kind to Lucretia van der Meulen, and Pelcert consented to let him live. He too was marooned on the mainland. The Batavia atrocity broke Fleet Commander Francisco Palsert. He was stripped of his commission and all his wages and possessions were confiscated. He died of malaria in Sumatra less than a year later. The Batavia's captain, Ariane Jacobs, was imprisoned, and Jan Everts, the bosun, was hung for his part in the rape of Lucretia. Weeb Hayes, a hailed hero, was promoted. The woman who was at the center of this unimaginable horror story, Lucretia van der Malen, never got to see her husband. He was dead when she reached Batavia. She returned to Holland, remarried, and never spoke of the nightmare. And of Jan Pelgrom de Bay and Wilterloos marooned on the mainland, nothing more was heard. But many decades later, there were reports of explorers encountering blue-eyed Aboriginal people, and it is feasible that one of their descendants may be reading these words at the moment. That is Yarn 1 from Great Australian Yarns. On our next episode, By the Fire Live, it will be Cannibal Convicts and the Monsters Who Made Them. A few friends for dinner. Have a great night.